Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban, and welcome to episode 319 of the podcast. It's October 1st, 2018. My guest today is Karen Martin, whose most recent book is titled Clarity First: How Smart Leaders and Organizations Achieve Outstanding Performance. Karen is the author of many books on lean, quality, and performance excellence. She's also a speaker and consultant. She has a bachelor's degree in microbiology from Pennsylvania State University and an MA in education from California State University, Bakersfield. So what is clarity? How can we work toward creating less fog and more clarity in organizations? We'll talk about things like that, along with a bit of discussion about clarity in performance metrics, as I write about in my recent book, Measures of Success. So if you'd like to get links to Karen's website, her books, more information about her, and the topics we're talking about today, you can go to www.leanblog.org/319. Well, Karen, it's great to have you back on the podcast here for the fourth time as a guest. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Mark. Thank you. It's really great to be back for a fourth time. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm excited to talk about your new book, Clarity First, and just kind of set the stage for listeners who maybe haven't heard the previous podcast. In the book, in the episode 151, we talked about previous book, The Outstanding Organization. In episode 190, we talked about the book Value Stream Mapping. And in our last discussion just over a year ago, episode 285, Karen, you had posed an interesting, provocative question: is lean dead? I think after we talked about that for a while, I think we shared the conclusion that it's not dead. Do I remember that right?
Yes, it's definitely not dead. Yes.
It's, there are local, it's not extinct as a field. There are some local cases, sadly, where organizations, dismantle their lean program. And maybe if it's still a program, maybe that's part of the problem. But it seems like it's more a matter of, organizations either, eventually figure out, through their practice of lean and improving how they're going about this, they figure it out. That's led, you've been thinking about those questions with some of your more recent books, right? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when Clarity First, I started thinking about what really compelled me to write it was that, first of all, clarity got a lot of attention in the Outstanding Organization, and I felt I needed to go deeper. But then I started putting a lot together as far as, top performance and the methods for getting that performance, including measurement and that whole realm of how do we know if we're doing well. And I discovered that when you strip away all of the language and the acronyms around lean management, it really is all about achieving a high level of clarity. And that's everything from the way the people are managed to the way the work is being done. So I think that what lean is probably transforming into is having a greater understanding of that link. And where lean falls apart, I have concluded in my, not a huge data set, but pretty good data set, that there's ample evidence that it's because the leaders that come into an organization simply aren't comfortable with that level of clarity. And that's a large reason why some of the success stories sadly go the other way.
So I'm just jotting down. I'd like to come back and have you elaborate on the idea of leaders not being comfortable with clarity. First off, how do you define clarity? If you can help us get some clarity around clarity, like you haven't heard that yet.
Yeah, exactly. It is information in any format that's concise and easy to understand, which I guess, concise doesn't necessarily make something easy to understand, but it's going away from messaging that you have to go, what does that mean? What are we supposed to do? What are our priorities? What's our purpose? All of those, what's the problem? Those kinds of questions that there's this kind of fundamental fog that exists in a lot of situations, a lot of emails, a lot of organizations, and kind of permeate the whole organization at times. So clarity is that, concise and easy to understand messaging that enables people and teams and whole organizations to perform at very high levels.
And so what would be an example of that fog? Would it be an example of, organization having their stated strategy, mission, vision, values, where people in the organization don't know, like, maybe, there's vague terms, or would that be an example of where fog trips people up? Or
absolutely. I mean, you can have everything from, and so one of the things I've learned is that organizations are more or less somewhat clear on their mission, what they do. Where they get very confused and where there can be absolute non-alignment in the executive team and possibly even in the boardroom is around what the purpose of the organization is and what the vision is, which they have to be linked or they don't make sense. And so when the people that work in the organization, well, when the leaders aren't clear about it, then that's the biggest problem. And there's no chance that the people in the organization will be clear if the leaders are unclear. And so, when I start asking people that question all the time, why are you in business? It's somewhat surprising how many people can't answer that question. Mm. And it's just hard to, have a whole group of people moving toward one direction, a true north, using lean vernacular, with that lack of clarity on why are we doing this?
It seems like it would be, an obvious preference. Like clarity is better than ambiguity. Sort of like we would say, through lean, waste is obviously a bad thing. So, come back. I'd be curious, for you to talk more about why leaders wouldn't be comfortable with clarity. Is that because they're maybe trying to gloss over the real reality, or what's going on?
It could be that. It could be that so I divide people into being either clarity pursuers, clarity avoiders, or the clarity blind. And a clarity avoider can get all the way into very sociopathic and criminal behavior. But it tends to be in that uncomfortable state where people, the truth, here's the thing about the truth, which is what clarity is closely linked to. When you know the truth, it's almost painful to not take action on the truth. You can have visceral pain if you know the truth and you can't take action on it. When you live in a more ambiguous state and it's a little foggy, it mitigates the pain because you can kind of not really know for sure. And so there is this non-action pass that you get in living in ambiguity. And this is true in personal lives as well as in business lives. And it's, it's not easy. Was it Tom Cruise or Jack Nicholson that yelled, "You can't handle the truth"?
No, it was Jack Nicholson.
Jack Nicholson. But Tom Cruise was in that movie, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that's who he yelled it too, right?
Yeah.
So, so it's almost like this not wanting to know. And we see this, and I'm sure you see it as well in senior leaders that will punish people for saying the truth of a situation. And I think you've even shared your previous role, internal, that you had that happening a fair amount.
I've had that problem has chased me around my entire career.
And it doesn't feel so good, does it?
Well, no. And, it's, we see scenarios in both, the political realm and the business world of certain executives that are always, sort of trying to create, distraction, I guess, is one way to battle clarity around something that you don't want, where you don't want clarity of, boy, our business has a failed strategy and we have execution problems. Anytime people start pointing that out, we'll just raise some other issue and create a distraction, right?
Yeah, it's the marketplace, it's this, it's that, it's the political environment. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to see how people kind of frame the reality that, if you dig deep enough, is not at all the reality that they're communicating. So it's a pretty widespread problem. And you talked about the whole purpose and strategy and vision and all that stuff, but it permeates all the way down to the lowest levels of an organization if you don't have a leader who honors and values clarity and has that as his or her operating mode much of the time. None of us are always clear. I mean, no one is perfect, but I do think that people have a bias toward tending to operate that way or tending not to operate that way. But the people who tend to not operate that way, once they see the value in it, and once they even have the self-awareness that in fact they're not operating with clarity, that's when the light bulbs turn on and the floodgates open and performance can really soar. So it's like taking off the handcuffs and and being able to run and do what you need to do, even if it's difficult.
Yeah.
Because clarity can be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes me think of, the difference in organizational cultures. One culture, it's celebrated. People are thanked for pointing out problems because that's the first step in solving the problem. And then, I've been in different workplaces where, if you brought up a problem, you were a troublemaker. That organizations would not take that well. So it seems like there's, one example of clarity might be the Toyota expression of no problems is a problem.
Right.
Like we have problems, we need to just accept that real reality and move forward.
Yeah, and I also think that what Toyota has brought to the world that helps a lot is they've taken the emotionality out of a problem by, saying, hey, it's a gap between where we are, where we need to be or want to be. And so it's a gap. It's, it's not like, oh my God, the sky is falling. It's a problem. I mean, it can be a sky is falling problem, right. But they take away the blame. They instill, a fear, maybe not fearless organization, but a less fearful organization. And I'm sure Dr. Deming is, smiling from heaven at that.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
Not the heaven part, but the smiling part.
Yes. And we know he's in heaven. How can he not be? And so, it's just the fear. And, the more I work in organizations of all types, the more I see how prevalent fear is. And fear is very laced in having a very ambiguous workplace. To me, it's the root cause behind an ambiguous workplace is fear.
Yeah. And, what's one other thing that comes to mind is, thinking about ambiguity, lack of clarity around a really serious, important issue in healthcare, because, here it is, the year 2018, 20 years after some of these, Institute of Medicine reports were published. And I still go to organizations where, lean people honestly have no idea how many people are being harmed, if not killed, by process-related preventable medical errors. And I think, I'm not blaming them for that, but I'm like, well, why that just doesn't get talked about in a lot of health systems openly and honestly. It's more like, well, cover up maybe isn't the opposite of clarity, but it's more like, well, if we don't talk about it, we don't have to stress over it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I've been working in healthcare a little more lately, and I've been seeing a lot of common themes on how much lip service is given to safety and how little is actually being done about it. Yeah. And it's disheartening, and I'm certainly raising the red flag when I see it. It's not an industry. I was sharing with a team the other day, in oil and gas, I had the great fortune of working with Chevron for 2 years. And I mean, they start every single meeting with a safety moment. There's not a meeting that starts with just going into the meeting. And it's either sharing a story of where you saw, something that didn't go well, or it's sharing a story of where someone, stepped up and did something that prevented some sort of an injury, or just even, talking about something in the news about another company and what they were doing or not doing that led to or prevented injury. And it just was so much part of the DNA. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, when you look at the number of people that die in the oil and gas industry every year and the number of people that are dying in healthcare, why is it not healthcare that's doing the safety moment every meeting? And why is it not healthcare that is getting riled up about safety? It boggles my mind.
Well, and some organizations do have those those daily safety huddles at an executive level, and there's a clearer, consistent messaging around the important. It's not even just messaging. That's not the right word, but there's a stronger focus.
Yeah, so I see safety huddles as well in many organizations, and I do think some do better than others, but I do think that what I see in these various organizations is that the safety huddles have gotten kind of, they've served this multiple purpose, and speaking of lack of clarity, they become this, information sharing about all kinds of things that aren't, I mean, you can draw an indirect line to safety, but they're not as direct a line to safety issues. And so I just feel like they've gotten a little morphed into something that is important. It's important for leadership to understand all these different issues, but it's gotten diluted so that it's not just about safety, which then exacerbates the problem that safety is not first and foremost in everyone's mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's a hard one.
Yeah. So how... kind of bringing things back to the topic of clarity. Sorry that I sidetracked us with my.
Oh, that was a good sidetrack.
Browsing there. But when it comes to talking about recommendations or solutions, if there's low clarity or ambiguity in an organization, what recommendations do you have for leaders to try to improve that?
Well, I broke it into 5 different elements that I find clarity often lacking. And so it's purpose, priorities, process, performance, and people. And every organization has a little different level of clarity versus not in those different areas. And, so every organization is a little different that we walk into on where we see the greatest opportunity. So it might be purpose. Now, healthcare happens to be an industry that's actually fairly clear on their purpose. So I don't think it really behooves us to try to clarify that a whole heck of a lot. Same with social services. And to some degree, often in education and government as well. When you get into, manufacturing, especially if it's something that's a very small component of a very large product, it just gets a little harder to tie the why there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that element. And then when it comes to priorities, well, I could talk for hours on the lack of clarity around priorities because I see it as a really big problem out there. I mean, with leaders not agreeing on the priorities, not agreeing on how they spend their money around trying to achieve whatever annual goals they've got, not agreeing on the approach for doing that. And that just trickles down into middle managers and the front lines, not knowing what should I be doing? What should I be spending my time on?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that. And some organizations are better than others at having, clear priorities for the year. And then we get into something that starts touching on your book, measures of success. I mean, and that's the whole process comes next. But when you get to performance, I'll skip over process for right now, but you get to performance, it just has been fascinating for me to see how many organizations don't truly know how they're performing on any level other than financial, on any level operationally, not macro, not micro, nothing. And if they have any clarity around how they want to be performing and what matters, they don't necessarily know how to go about measuring that and how to go about improving it so they get closer and closer to the levels that they want to be at. So it's, that lack of clarity around, are we healthy? Are we not healthy? Are we doing good? Are we not doing good? What should we be doing? I mean, think about a football game and going with a blank scoreboard and you're trying to figure out who's winning and what quarter is it and who has the ball. And I mean, all those fundamental decisions that you need in order to know what to do as a crowd, as a person in the crowd. Do you clap? Do you boo? What do you do?
I mean, they don't, like in a basketball game, they don't run a quarterly report at the end of every quarter, like, hey, by the way, you're up 12.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you look at, the refs and the coaches and the team members themselves are studying the board to know where are we, what are we doing, what do we need to do? And there's just this fundamental lack of clarity around that in all levels of many organizations.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's, to use your term, a lack of clarity sometimes in the connection between process and performance. And, that's where in my book, I try to remind people that, there's that old expression, what gets measured gets managed.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of times people don't really talk about, well, what do you mean by get managed? And we don't mean managing the metric. That leads to people fudging the numbers,
Right.
gaming the system. We need to improve the process or the system that generates those results. I mean, if we talk about metrics as results, it's right there in the word. It's the result of the work you're doing.
Right.
And I think sometimes people lose sight of that. If they are keeping score and they say we're not doing well, they focus too much on the score instead of, maybe, to use your football analogy, the playbook.
Right. Yeah. So back to your comment, I really love that comment about the quote about what you measure what you measure gets managed, or what
gets measured gets managed.
Yeah. That whole thing is so true. And the corollary to that is be careful what you measure.
Mm-hmm.
Because, to your point about gaming the metrics and things like that, there's just so much of that I see where the measurement, we'll take healthcare, since you operate in that world pretty heavily, and I'm increasingly so. Door to doc. So this metric just bugs the crap out of me, because door to doc, what I see happening in EDs all across the nation is they put doctors up, close to the waiting area. They pull them out of the exam rooms, and they have them there so they can meet a metric of door to doc within, you name the number of minutes. And the patient never gets through the ED any faster.
Yeah.
And it's just such a crazy metric that, is pretty widespread. And, when clients say to me, we have to report that to someone, I'll say, okay, you can report it to whoever you have to report it to, but do not put that on your wall, because that is going to drive all the wrong behavior, and it's not going to get you where you're trying to go, which is faster, higher quality patient throughput.
Yeah. And that's a great example of, distorting the system. And, I think when there's not a good connection between what really matters, having a measure that reflects what matters, and then people's ability to improve the system,
right,
to best meet those results. I try to make those connections, within your framework, between performance and problem solving.
Right.
That if we're not at the level of performance where we need to be, people listening, I mean, this is, a lean podcast. So, people think about, systematic improvement methods like A3 problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
There's a time where, when we see a gap in performance, we don't find the answer by asking, well, why was yesterday's day bad? Right. When we've got a consistent process, we need to look at improving the process instead of just reacting to the most recent data point.
Yeah, and also not overreacting, to the point in your book, not overreacting to one or two data points that are simply variation in the system that aren't really going to be going toward a trend that you need to do something about, and being more aware of that variation that exists within a process, that's acceptable variation versus unacceptable variation.
Yeah, or it could be framed as there's all kinds of different language used in these methodologies: routine variation versus extraordinary variation, or you could say typical variation. And we can do things even in in the context of lean to boost the average performance of a system. We can also take actions that reduce variation. That's not the exclusive domain of Six Sigma, I would say.
And this may not be exactly tied to this exact topic we're talking about, but it triggered something in me that I've been seeing more and more of as we're getting larger and larger data sets over a longer and longer time period with clients, is that everyone always believes that, oh, you can't predict anything, oh, it's all high variation, oh, it's all over the place. And and that's pretty common to be a first reaction when you ask about what's the total number, or what's the average number of minutes, what's the average number of patients, what's the average percent quality, what's the average reject rate, what's the average on-time delivery rate, whatever it might be, high variation. And then when you look at the data over a long period of time, it follows often these very predictable patterns. And when you can see those patterns and then get to the root cause of why those patterns exist, that's pretty powerful stuff. And that's when you can get really big movements in performance, which, I think there's just a need to get better and better at knowing how to measure and how to look at things and what time period's appropriate and all those corollary questions.
Yeah. I'm curious, if you've got other thoughts, kind of going back to what to measure, because one other thing I jotted down here, we're talking about, the focus on financial metrics. I have a friend of mine who is a veterinarian. He's both owned his own practice and worked for, a large national chain. And, and he's been studying lean the last few years. And I think he's actually writing a book on lean and veterinary medicine. But, when he was reading my book and he was reflecting, and he said, well, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, I literally cannot think of a single veterinary clinic metric that's not cost or finance related.
Wow.
And he was being serious. I'm like,
wow.
Well, how would you measure? And, he knows patient safety can be an issue in the veterinary medicine world. He knows waiting times matter, quality and outcomes matter, but it sounds like it's just not being measured. And that really kind of gave him a moment to pause and reflect on that. Have you tried to have these conversations to help somebody go to more of a balanced scorecard, if you use that term, or what have you found that helps?
Yeah. So in Clarity First, I did talk about the different methodologies that are out there that help an organization be a little more balanced. And I take financial metrics to task quite a bit in the book, and talk about the need for operational. But, I decided to simplify it even further than what Balanced Scorecard does, and just say, hey, there are metrics that matter to the business, and there are metrics that matter to your customers. And you need both sets of metrics presented if you want to look at things in a more holistic way. And, some of them can be both. I mean, you can have financial metrics that actually really affect the customer experience and vice versa. So they could be both, but to have exclusively financial metrics, because one of the things I always say is, financial performance is an outcome of phenomenal operations. And of course, you have to have the right product priced right. The market needs to want it. But, once you have that, then operations are what lead you down that path of money. And it's an outcome, not the be all end all.
And as with a lot of things, that's sort of a hard habit for people to break, whether it's, being, stuck on, this is what we've always measured. I presented a webinar earlier about, some of the methods from my book, Measures of Success. And the one point I was trying to make is that, when people have, what they call it, a scorecard, or, they post their metrics, like having a grid of numbers doesn't, to me, to use your phrase, that doesn't create a lot of clarity.
Right. Yes, I have the same thing in my book. We copied each other.
But I think what provides much more clarity is just having a dang chart. And it could be just a simple run chart, just to visualize the ups and downs and help people see how much a metric typically fluctuates and what average it's fluctuating around, because that seems to be the case, not at least 9 times out of 10. Some metric is just fluctuating around a stable average. It's not getting better. It's not getting worse. It's just fluctuating.
And here's the thing that I think is also at play here is that once you get people, especially if there's improvement team members that are kind of charged with looking at performance and helping in some way, shape, or form with improvement, once you get people understanding how to think about it and how to decide what to measure and all that, then it comes down to actually doing it. So one of the things I've been, suggesting to every client is that the people that are looking at measurement, which should be pretty much almost everyone, have to have rudimentary Excel skills. I mean, you don't have to do Excel. You can do hand-drawn charts, but when you want to start looking over a long period of time, it gets really cumbersome to have hand-drawn charts over a long period of time. And most of the time when I see tables and I go back to the people and they're not in line chart form or run charts, I find out they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And so this is a fundamental skill set that needs to be taught for sure in colleges, but if not, then within the organization, people need to know how to create a visual that's clear about how they're actually performing.
That's a good point. And I mean, I guess that table of numbers is easier for people to put together. There's the technical skill, and then I sidetracked myself from the point I was going to make at the end of that webinar, where I tried to make this case that charts are better than tables of numbers, and somebody asked a question at the end, basically like, but my executives want to see the numbers in that format. So what do we do? I'm like, well, how do we affect change with anything? At some point you can only, invite somebody to learn about a different way. Do you try to do, some sort of demonstration? I think the same would be true with, people they have a high comfort with ambiguity. Mm-hmm. How could I convince them to try clarity? I mean, these are similar questions, right?
Yeah, and I guess I would also challenge whether that's really true. Not to say that the person that said this is lying, but I think a lot of people misunderstand what executive needs are, and they don't feel comfortable necessarily saying, okay, I hear you like this chart. What if we did it this way? Do is this any better or no? And then you find out if they really mean, no, I want a table. I want a table format, and that's how I want my numbers. Because I really can't imagine any executive preferring a table of numbers over a visual, a chart. I really can't. And I hope to be proven wrong by someone, but it just sometimes people are so afraid to like suggest alternatives or, and I think that I'm doubtful that the line chart wouldn't be embraced.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it's a good question. Do they test that hypothesis of, well, this is how they want it? I mean, I think one of the challenges, or one of the reasons I wrote my book was trying to expose people to some of these approaches for not just making the chart, but how to use the chart and manage your improvement over time. A lot of people just haven't been exposed to these ideas that have origins in Dr. Deming and people before him, where I think there's a lot of times just this blind spot where they don't know a different way. So I think you're onto something. We could test that hypothesis and see how they respond to something different.
Well, it's a good point, because when I think back to my history, yes, I took a statistics class in college, undergrad, but I hated it, and it was mainly because of the teacher, and I didn't really grasp statistics the way I probably could have if well, one could argue I could have applied myself more, but I wasn't motivated to apply myself more because it was so awful going to class. And then I was fortunate when I started out, with in medical technology, a clinical lab scientist, everything in the lab was pretty much run chart related. And so it was just part of my work from day one. And that's how I became more comfortable with measurement and more comfortable with looking at performance over time and knowing when you should react and don't need to react and all those things. We had upper and lower limits on everything. And so I didn't know you didn't work that way in the beginning until it was, many, many years later, moving into different industries, I saw, oh, wow, not only do people not work that way necessarily, they don't even know that they could or should work that way.
Right.
So it's, I don't know what we do to get that knowledge and learning out there as quickly as it's needed, but it is pretty desperately needed.
Yeah. And, I've always tried to remind myself and go by the mantra of, you can't, I think to some extent, you can't blame somebody for what they haven't been taught.
Right.
So, if people haven't been exposed to some of these methods and they've never read a Deming book or Donald Wheeler's book, Understanding Variation. But then, at the same time, it's funny when you say, well, I could have applied myself. I think back to the scenario I brought up earlier, somebody, doing lean work in a hospital. If they've been there for a couple of years and they don't know the scale of the patient safety problems, then I wonder how much are they really trying to learn about healthcare?
Well, and that is my next point. I love it. Great
Okay.
segue. So here's another thing that I find missing and again, this is not about tearing down the people that are trying to do good work in organizations and are charged with some form of improvement, playing a role in improvement. But this is saying that organizations have not given the people that are in those roles the necessary development they need to succeed in those roles. And what I mean by that is, many times people in improvement roles don't have a business degree. They haven't operated at an executive level to learn business at that level. So there's this huge gulf between what they need to know and what they do know. And if you don't know what you don't know, then it gets just exacerbated. And I just again, I'm noodling on what am I going to do about this, because I've identified the problem and I think I know some of the root causes. I don't know what the countermeasure is, but people need to understand business, and looking at how you measure success in business is a big part of this. And so I'm noodling a lot on that these days.
One other thing I want to come back to, because you reminded me of another another company I worked for in my career when we were talking about clarity and ambiguity. So there was a company I worked for, manufacturing company, and they talk about their behavioral interviewing and what are the characteristics of people that they were specifically looking to hire. And we were evaluating, so I managed to get hired there. And then, you go through the annual review process or 360 feedback process. And one of the things, you're asked, people asked to evaluate, here's their phrase: dealing with ambiguity. That was considered one of like the 5 core traits that they wanted in an employee. And it was, it was a high growth company. It was growing about 30% a year, 30 billion in sales. So it had its growing pains of, over a decade, going from, being small and high growth to being large and high growth. And the things that got them there weren't the things they needed for the future. But dealing with ambiguity in a way almost became a crutch or an excuse.
It does.
Saying like, well, here's some, an opportunity to clarify this process and we could do it better. And I went, well, you need to be more comfortable with ambiguity.
I know, isn't it kind of stupid?
I thought so. And I left that company in less than 2 years, but.
So here's 2 things that I see these in job descriptions, and that's what makes it really hard. When you go out and recruit people and say 2 things. 1, you must be able to multitask. Well, we now know multitasking doesn't even exist for 2 cognitive tasks. So that's kind of a crazy requirement. And then the second one is you have a high comfort with or being able to operate in a highly ambiguous environment. I actually think that 9 times out of 10, it's just the misuse of the word ambiguity. And what they mean is being able to operate in an uncertain environment. And there's a big difference in those 2 words to me, because ambiguity is man-made and it's not good and it needs to be gotten rid of. You can become crystal clear on something that's uncertain. You can't know what the outcome is going to be, but you can become very clear that there's uncertainty in this area. You can also become very clear on the signs and symptoms of an uncertain situation turning one way or the other. And so uncertainty is a reality. We live with it everywhere, every part of our lives, and it's not going away. It's natural. Whereas ambiguity is man-made. And so I don't know. I'm curious if others may think that it's a little bit of a misuse of the word, or they really do mean we don't want to be clear, deal with it, people.
Yeah. I mean, it could have also been phrased, instead of dealing with ambiguity, dealing with chaos.
Well, another one, we don't want to get people that are comfortable dealing with chaos, do we? Oh,
well, I mean, the people who are the firefighters, I mean, there are some people who really do thrive on chaos.
Yeah, well, they do thrive on it personally, but it's not good for the organization, as you know.
But I think you make a really good point, the distinction between ambiguity and uncertainty, because I think of Eric Ries, and in the Lean Startup book, and he talks about, well, what is a startup? And I just pulled up his definition: a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good.
Came to mind, because there's a lot of uncertainty when you or I write a book. I mean, I think a book is a startup. There's uncertainty about whether anyone's going to buy it or care, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, it is a little mini startup.
Yeah. So what do you have other books that will be offshoots of the Outstanding Organization, or what other
good question. Very good question. I don't know. I doubt I'm done, but I might be done. I'm not sure with that format, with long format like a book. I don't know. This book was very difficult to write. It was very difficult to get through the publishing process. It was very difficult to figure out how to promote it. In today's ADD world. I don't know what this is the first time I've not known that I have another book in me that I want to get out there. The one thing I'm noodling on is just transformation in general. Not in general meaning it's going to be a vague book of platitudes about transformation, but the Outstanding Organization doesn't really talk through the steps that you really need to go through if you want to transform the organization, and the different elements of that. I may do something like that, but I don't know. I'm not going to do anything if I can't contribute something very, very new to that thinking.
Yeah. Well, and something may strike you.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, it took me a while, between books and, something, this idea has been percolating for about 4 years or so.
Good book. It's a really good book, and I'm glad you did it. Measures of Success, everybody.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And no, but I was said when it comes to writing, people ask me, should I? They ask if they should write a book, and I said, well, when people say they want to write a book, that leads to the starting of the writing. When people say I need to write this book, that's what leads to a book actually getting completed. And for better or for worse, this book for me was something I felt like I needed to write, that I was going to hate myself if I didn't do it. And I learned a lot in the process. I know you learn a lot in the process of researching and writing and clarifying your thoughts, right?
Yeah, and I should have been able to predict that you would write this book, because I did notice that you were getting more and more clear about the whole issue of variation and process performance and all of that in social media posts and blog posts and things like that. So it does seem like it was a very good natural outpouring of what you were pulling together and connecting the dots on.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And when I was giving talks on this a couple years ago, I'm glad I didn't go write a book first, because teaching workshops and giving talks, I realized I was being ambiguous. I wasn't speaking clearly about what happens when we have a metric that's just fluctuating around an average, and it's just quote unquote noise. And I was emphasizing, don't overreact to the noise. Don't overreact to each data point. What I was leaving unsaid or not said clearly was, well, you still need to figure out how to improve the results.
Right.
But we do so in a less reactive. Again, that's why I think the A3 is a great analytical framework to go and figure out how do we actually boost performance. So and hopefully writing blog posts and everything, I don't know, hopefully that increased the clarity.
Well, and I hope also an outcome of your book will be avoiding what I call the flatlining scenario, where I just had a new client, a couple people on the team, and I went over and we got a lot of their metrics and their business plan and all that up front, and pages of stuff. And I was like, flipping, that's pretty good. Oh my God. I saw these charts, and they've been measuring some key performance measures that they wanted to pay attention to for a pretty long period of time. And there was no difference from the beginning, and it was about a 2-year period, and it was just flatlining. And they weren't anywhere near where the target was. And the target seemed really reasonable to me, not like it was a crazy target. And so that was the beginning of our conversation when we met with the executives on day one, is like, what's up with that? What's going on? Talk to us. And that, we learned a lot about how they view problem solving, what the skill level is around problem solving, and all of that. So, flatlining doesn't feel good, for anyone. And so being able to get people performing at top levels, I know is a lot of what drives you, certainly what drives me and all of us in improvement.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and that passion comes through in your work and your writing, and really appreciate you taking time to come and not only talk about concepts from your book, but I appreciate it was your suggestion that we could try to weave together some of the themes between your book and mine. So thank you for suggesting that.
And thank you, because they do have a lot of common themes in them. And I think, maybe we're going to get into this less fearful place where people will feel comfortable being more clear about performance. And it is a measure of success after all.
So before we wrap up here, how can people buy your book? Where can they learn more? Where can they find you online?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so it's clarityfirstbook.com. We'll lead them to the book page on our website, clarityfirstbook.com. And then we have a quiz that people can take to learn about their own individual comfort with clarity, and also the organization's experience with clarity. And that's clarityfirstquiz.com. That's a fun little quiz to get a baseline and look at where you want to close some of those gaps.
All right. Well, and those are good. Those are your URLs with clarity.
Thank you.
Remember those and go find those. And I'll link to all of that in the show notes as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. It was really great to be on the podcast again. It's always fun.
Thanks. All right. And if you come back for a 5th time, maybe there's a special jacket you get, like 5 posts on Saturday Night Live.
Or a gold microphone or something like that. I don't know.
I don't have the budget for that, but that's a good idea. You listen to me. Oh, I shot down your idea. That was so non-Kaizen-y of me.
It could be a hand-drawn gold microphone. You've got budget for that.
All right. Well, again, our guest today has been Karen Martin. Her most recent book, again, is titled Clarity First. So the 5 Ps: purpose, priorities, process, performance, and problem solving. I love that. I think you'll get a lot out of Karen's book, and then hopefully follow it up with my book, especially on the process, performance, problem solving piece. It's fun making those connections, and it's fun talking to you about the books, Karen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.